Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. It's great to welcome you here to Leeds Arts University for the closing event of Laurence Figgis After. As many of you will know, Laurence Figgis is an artist and writer based in Glasgow, where he works as a lecturer in painting and printmaking at the Glasgow School of Art. He also has a Master's in the History of Art at the University of Glasgow, where his research project focused on Walt Disney and Surrealism. He has exhibited across Scotland and England, including Hugs and Fun at the Glasgow Project Room in 2013, and Human Shaped, also in Glasgow, in 2016. I think Laurie has the best titles for his exhibition. He will shortly publish Bad Retail, a new piece of fiction writing in the Journal of Writing and Creative Practice. So look out for that one in winter 2017. And it's a special guest issue edited by Suzanne Thompson and Laura Edbrook. And Suzanne has also written the interpretation text for this show, and you're welcome to take that away with you today. After presents a new body of work, but I think it's fair to say that it develops Laurie's long-term research and preoccupations. The title is quite loaded. After suggests an extension to the story, the need to find out what happens after the happily ever after of the fairy tale. Once Sleeping Beauty and Snow White have awoken from their glass coffins, what next? Once Cinderella has ensnared her prince and married him, what next? Moreover, what happens to the infamous glass slipper? Does it ultimately become a museum artifact, as in Hans Christian Andersen's The Princess and the Pea? This show explores the afterlife of the character of the bride, and is thus deeply critical, I would suggest, of those very capitalist master narratives which insist that we ultimately end up happy, despite appearing light-hearted and candy colourful. In capitalism, desire is, by its very nature, positioned as insatiable. Afters also suggests some kind of sugar-coated dessert, and by extension, a kind of addiction to kitsch and to decadence, despite being educated in institutions such as this to acquire a much cooler and more detached kind of taste. On closer inspection, we find that this exhibition is laden with mid-20th century art historical themes and references, particularly to the collage methods and bricolage imagination of Robert Rauschenberg and Pablo Picasso, but also to the esoteric iconographies of Marcel Duchamp and Alberto Giacometti. So Laurie is predominantly exploring a moment when modernist techniques tilt into postmodern narrative concerns. And one way to think about this show is how it might represent a kind of allegory of that moment, and what it might mean for us as makers, thinkers, and viewers today. And so just before we hear from Laurie, I want to read an extended quote from Brian O'Doherty from The White Cube, The Ideology of the Gallery Space. Quote, "Couldn't modernism be taught to children as a series of Aesop's fables? Think of such fables as Who Killed Illusion, or How the Edge Revolted Against the Centre. The man who violated the canvas could follow Where Did the Frame Go? It would be easy to draw morals. Think of the vanishing impasto that soaked away and then came back and got fat. And how would we tell the story of the little picture plane that grew up and got so mean? How it evicted everybody, including Father Perspective and Mother Space, who had raised such nice children, and left behind only the horrid result of an incestuous affair called abstraction, who looked down on everyone. Fables give you more latitude than art history." End quote. And so, can you please join me in welcoming Laurence Figgis for his talk today, After, Visual Storytelling in Post-War Culture, from Picasso to the Well-Loved Tale.
Okay then, so if you've had a chance to look around the exhibition already, or later when you look around it, one of the things that most immediately strike you is the presence of a narrative, the presence of a story running through it. And this is suggested in the imagery, but it's also suggested formally. For example, through devices that are suggestive of sequential narrative genres like the comic strip or storyboard, through the use of languages associated with the dramatic arts like costume design and set design and so forth, and also through the titles. And also you may have noticed that in the first of the research vitrines there is a piece of text included, and this is an excerpt from a story that was written in conjunction with the making of the images in the exhibition. And the first reading that I'm going to do is from that story, just to give you an idea. It's just a short extract to give you an idea of what that is like. By the time the solvent boys arrived, the Delta hedge was full. Here and there, among the brightly dressed figures, the light was swallowed by the Bolsheviks' dark uniforms and the band's more sombre clothing. The Monothi's hats were shaped like the heads of screws with rectangular indents in their hemispherical crowns. The bride, at least, wore some bright colours for the occasion. Her dress was rather dour, but her veil and petticoat sparkled with coquettish hues, where emblems of the two religions entwined, as if in love. Now a hush was falling on the temple. The choir's last refrain of corporate day had faded out, leaving only a trace of an echo in the vaulted space. The long queen, having reached the altar, was slowly sinking to her knees, her massive skirts rising to engulf her. She settled at last into a crouching position, resting on a tiny gilded hassock, her face pressed against the velvet cover as though kissing it through the layers of her bouchette. There were no vows for the great monarch. He shunned the corpusci eternally, even on the occasion of his march, and few had ever seen him in the flesh. Besides, there were no vows for him, only for the bride, and she delivered them from her hunched position of civility as custom required, only lifting her head slightly, every now and again, whenever the old cleric Solix prompted her to speak. He intoned the vows first, and she repeated them, her voice following his like an echo. "Permanent Rose," said Solix when the vows were done, "you have spoken before Con. We will now proceed to the glorification of the heavenly Arbor." And he went on with the prayer, oblivious at first of the sound of anxious whispering. With a great cacophony of rustling and clumping, the Corpus Major struggled to fall to its knees. The late arriving entity was tall, magnificently dressed in the most solvent and corporate garments that flashed and shivered as she advanced on the crouching queen. By the time she reached the altar, at least 2/3 of the corpus were on their knees. All those who remained standing were dressed in dark retail. "The goddess of land services," a Kent was heard to say, and a great murmuring rose up as the Sorix present launched into the first words of the credo. The Fguk had raised her hands for silence. "You may all rise. You're making your guests feel rather awkward, I think. That includes you, Solix. The bands are lonely in their upright state, and you don't look at all comfortable." Indeed, the cleric, being too far from the ground to kneel without first hopping down from his pedestal, had been forced to make an approximation of a bow in his seat, and this was rather awkward. At the goddess's prompting, he righted himself, though somewhat gingerly. "This is a corporate celebration. What does it honour?" "Love, Your Grace." "Love," said Cora. "Some would say heresy." "I should like very much to speak to the bride, and would do so were she not at this moment incommoded. I'll not spoil the ancient proprieties by asking her to stand and have parley with me now. I'll speak to this young Arthur instead." Her eyes came to rest on the Bolshevik Courage, who, like all the bands present, had remained standing. He returned the Fguk's gaze, trembling, but with a certain surety. "Step forward, Bolshevik Courage." The young soldier, having glanced nervously at those around him for some sign as to how to proceed, and having received none, approached the Fguk a few steps from the altar. She was terrifying to look at. Her mouth frightened him the most. When he looked there, he was conscious of being able to see more than he should of the moist hollow between her lips, of light reflecting and light penetrating there in quite an unnatural way, of saliva clinging to the inside of her teeth. Lord love you, Corpusci, her teeth were made of glass. So if you want to read the whole story, that's going to be published, as Kat said, in the Journal of Writing and Creative Practice at the end of this year, and will be available online in about 6 months' time once the embargo on the text has been lifted as part of the institution where I work, Glasgow School of Art. They have an open access policy for any research that's produced by its research staff. Okay then, so I'm now going to proceed to read to you from the introduction that accompanies that story in the publication. And in this very short essay, I talk about the idea of romanticism as a literary genre and as a literary form and structure, and that the relationship of that structure to the structure that we associate with modernism, principally this idea of collage, and also the idea of how time and how history are represented in such a way as to demonstrate a very self-conscious awareness of the present and the future. And the term that's often used to describe that process is the term anachronism, which is sometimes used as an insulting term, but also, as I'll go on to talk about, has been used as a deliberate strategy by many artists, particularly from the kind of 19th century and accelerating in the 20th century onwards. And the text begins with a quote, which you can see also up on the slide. These quilted snatches are viewed as past moments of clarity, beauty, civilization and spiritual elation that must somehow be retained and restitched, spliced onto the present, as if they were alive, as if they were types of intelligent, deathless energy. And this so as to allow the past, with a nourishing insistence, to feed the present. And that's a quote from a poet and philosopher, Paul Oppenheimer, in an essay from 1998 called Goethe and Modernism. The romantic novel, which is a product of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, often tends towards a fractured compositional form. As defined by Robert Miles, who is a critic of English literature, the salient feature of romantic fiction appears to be its failure to conform to and remain within accustomed boundaries. The generic boundaries, the seam lines remain, just badly stitched together. And as another literary critic, Robert Keeley, observed in his 1972 study of romantic literature, whereas the best romantic poetry achieves, indeed embodies moments of synthesis, the romantic novel is an almost continuous display of divisive tension, paradox, and uncertain focus. And Miles attributes this tendency to the romantic interest in the subjective and the irrational, graveyard imagery, the supernatural, and so forth. He concludes that while such material was workable in the medium of poetry, it pulled against the qualities that had become intrinsic to the novel form: duration, a concern with community, and the objective representation of events. And the archetypal romantic novel that he has in mind is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is itself concerned with a persona who is put together, as you remember from the familiar cinematic images. For today's reader, familiar with 20th and 21st century techniques of collage, the discordant, stitched-together quality of romantic fiction embodies a certain formal and intellectual appeal. It was seen as a failing in the genre by realist-oriented literary critics of the past. The surrealist Max Ernst made his collage novels, which you can see in this slide, most famously Une Semaine de Bonté, 1934, from cut-up engravings to 19th century Gothic fictions and melodramas, the sensationalist offspring of earlier romantic literature. As the American art historian Hal Foster states, Ernst's collage only articulates what is implicit in the found illustrations. Gothic fiction is a genre already given over to the unconscious, a genre in which repressed desires are hysterically expressed. So I don't know if you're familiar with these works, but they're made from like illustrations of sort of 19th century penny dreadfuls and also 19th century kind of catalogues and kind of scientific manuals. And he had a big collection of these and he cut them up and stuck them back together again and then made lithographs from them and published the lithographs in book form, which he described as collage novels. And they have a kind of fragmentary narrative running through them, which is like the archetypal dream narrative that we associate with realism, but it comes from this real material, which at the time that he was working in the 1930s was historic material, but probably close enough for him to associate with his ancestry. The important point that is made is that they come partly from the language of Victorian melodrama, which the Surrealists liked because they saw it already as having this kind of unreal, kind of dreamlike quality to it, which they wanted to exploit further. So, my own story, Bad Retail, which is the story that I read the little bit from just there, is a work of fiction linked to a series of narrative paintings, some of which are in this exhibition. The text was originally disseminated through a series of exhibitions in the form of printed handouts that were included alongside the visual text so that the viewer of the exhibition could read this fragmented narrative while looking at the images. And at the most basic level, the paintings illustrate the events described in the story, and the story expands upon the scenes and characters portrayed in the paintings. And the term collage is quite appropriate to use in relation to the story itself, and even more so, I think, to the visual imagery. And just to kind of talk you through a bit where that comes from, I've got a few examples here of collage, historical practice of collage, some of which you might be familiar with. These are quite interesting examples. Recently, a discovery was made of a whole collection of 19th century collages, and these were made by middle and upper class European and American women who would collect family, it was in the early days of photography, obviously, they would collect early daguerreotypes, family photographs, also photographs of celebrities of the time, such as members of the royal family of the time, and then they would make scrapbooks out of them. And some of these were quite imaginative and rather strange, where they would cut out the heads and put them on, these bodies of animals, which they would draw. Many of these women were very skilled at drawing and working with watercolour. And when they were exhibited about 7 years ago in a big exhibition in New York, there was lots of debate about, what is the relationship of this to artists like the Surrealists? Did the Surrealists know about this? Are these, women artists who were doing this as a hobby, were they kind of Surrealists without realising that they were Surrealists? And they're very kind of interesting and curious works. Another classic example, again, associated with Surrealism, this is a Salvador Dali collage, and it's got a great title, Shirley Temple, the youngest and most sacred monster of the cinema in her time, and that is Shirley Temple's head and partly with kind of drawn areas as well. This is Hannah Hock, who's an artist who was originally associated with the Berlin Dada in the 1920s, producing very subversive and politicized works in collage. And later she went on to various other works, including this book, which was designed as a book for children. It's called Picture Book, and she's again using these found source material, magazine pages, book pages, cutting them up to make these strange animals. And here are a couple of examples of me using collage in my own work, and these are a series of works that led up to the works that are on display in this exhibition. And these are mixed media works, drawing, gouache, crayon, also with areas cut out and pasted on, and they are mounted on top of stretched canvases, kind of in a little bit of an homage to synthetic cubist collage. And this is one involving printed material alongside the drawn and painted and cut out elements. And here's another one on different surfaces. The left-hand side is on a stretched canvas, the right-hand side is on a kind of foam board, as the sort that you'd get in kind of corporate advertising. And again, it's a mixture of drawing and printed material collage together. So the term collage is also appropriate when thinking about the story's fragmented approach to history and cultural memory. In the illustrations to the story, references to the Cold War and mid-century modernism coexist with images and forms inspired by symbolist, futurist and cubist painting, Rococo-style interiors, and late 20th century street fashion. So here in these works, you'll see the use of this term dye sublimation print. That is a type of digital printmaking in this case onto canvas, made from digital images that were made in Photoshop from a range of material, my own drawing, some found imagery, and also sometimes my own photographs. I even went as far as making these small-scale models and then photographing them when I was trying to visualize these strange interior spaces that I had in my mind. And so the digital here is being used at quite a basic level. It's a very perfunctory use of Photoshop, just working in very basic levels as just an extension of the collage process and an attempt to bring collage and painting together. Obviously they have this layer of color over the surface, which is again done digitally, which kind of homogenizes the whole surface. So you might not immediately see that they are kind of collage. They have this kind of Frankenstein's monster kind of quality to them. And again, as I mentioned there, not only is this sense of a kind of physical collage of a picture being put together, but there's also a mismatch of different times and different aesthetic styles that we wouldn't normally bring together, which you can see some of these kind of illustrated there in these examples, symbolist painting and mid-19th century royal portraiture, and then also involving references to Duchamp and futurism and kind of going back into the 20th century. So what I've written here is that I wanted to dramatize the equivalence of collage as a physical and now increasingly virtual medium, so that a thing that you can now do in the virtual world using digital processes, to anachronism, which is a temporal or a time-based displacement of images. And I was inspired by works of romantic historical fiction, so this is a subgenre of romantic fiction, in which the simulation of the past often fails. And this is either because the provenance of certain objects has become confused, they've got them mixed up when certain things were invented and not invented and so forth, or because the author's contemporary sensibility molds their description of period costume or speech. The relationship with the practice of collage lies with this idea of displacement, with the idea of an object removed from its proper time period. And similarly, the practice of collage, the act of cutting something out of one image and putting it into another, allows a given material to be transposed or appear to be transposed from its specific cultural context. This kind of tendency is probably most obvious when this genre is translated into cinema. So historical romance novels, like Hollywood costume films, often fail to represent the past authentically. As the fashion historian Edward Mader has demonstrated, these glitches are not really mistakes as such. They're not done completely unconsciously. They arise out of Hollywood's desire to seduce its audience with an elaborate and excessive vision of the past. In other words, to show history through rose-coloured glasses. And so you'd be familiar maybe with things like these Romanesque epics that were very popular in the 1950s and 60s. And there's just no doubt that this is taking place in the 1960s. This is Liz Taylor with her slightly ancient Egypt-orientated version of her probably normal eye makeup or something. So, and there'll be other little nuances that you notice all the time that prevent you from completely locating it in the time that it's meant to be evoking. This is another very interesting example if you haven't seen it. This is actually a costume sketch by Travis Banton, the great kind of Hollywood designer, for Marlene Dietrich, playing the Empress Catherine of Russia in a film called The Scarlet Empress. There's a bit of a Russian theme going on here. But this is an unusual example of a Hollywood costume drama. It has everything that you want from a costume drama, all the kind of frou-frou and pageantry, but it was made by Josef von Sternberg, and who was a director coming out of the tradition of German Expressionism, and it uses German Expressionist techniques, carrying this world almost into the realm of surrealism and exposing the kind of dark underbelly of this world of kind of court luxury and intrigue. So, anachronism is in this sense the wound by which a factual or partially factual narrative bleeds into pure fantasy. Writers like Sir Walter Scott and Alexandre Dumas père often drew on folklore and legend when bringing historical events or figures to life, and the visual tropes of historical romance have in turn coloured the depiction of fantasy literature itself. In the 1960s, the British illustrator Eric Winter created a series of images for the Well-Loved Tales. And this was a really popular brand of books for children published by the Ladybird Group. They continued to be republished until well into the 80s. These were the books that I grew up with as a child, and I think British children of my generation would be very familiar with. And they're illustrated throughout with these highly coloured, probably originally painted, I think, illustrations. And Winter portrayed the fairy tale characters as contemporary film star types or fashion models, dressed in medieval or 18th century costume in settings realised with a charmingly ersatz Hollywood flavour. So when we're thinking about how this operates, perhaps we've touched on ideas about how it operates on a kind of ideological or possibly political level, and this myopic tendency, the transformation of history into myth, can be regarded as politically dubious, perhaps depending on what your political point of view is. But the act of nostalgia for many commentators is easily tainted by conservatism. And as Jeremy Tambling puts it, Jeremy Tambling is a philosopher and critic who specialises in the study of anachronism in literature. And he writes that the ruling class uses anachronism to preserve the status quo, and he quotes from Charles Dickens writing in Bleak House, which was published in 1853-4. Those people who are alarmed at the prospect of social reform would make the vulgar very picturesque and faithful by putting back the hands upon the clock of time and cancelling a few hundred years of history. So as you could probably tell when I read out from my own story, there are some magical elements in there. There are sudden disappearances, there are prophetic beings, there are things made of glass that shouldn't be made of glass, and so forth. But the fairy tale is not the only imaginative genre being referred to there. The characters in the story speak a sort of patois, inspired by office terminology, using words like file and corporation. And this language of bureaucracy points towards a different kind of imaginative fantasy, that of George Orwell's Newspeak and the authoritarian language of classic dystopian narratives. So stories about the future also evoke imaginary world, and the author in that instance has to invent her nightmare, quite often, as was the case with Orwell, Anthony Burgess or Ursula Le Guin. She has to invent or at least appropriate and adapt a language to describe that world. So in that sense, dystopian fiction, although it's often motivated by very polemical concerns, is only partially a realist genre. So we might also concede that a major, if subliminal, purpose of Margaret Atwood's visionary feminist dystopian novel The Handmaid's Tale is to stage a remarkably aestheticized encounter of the pre-modern past and the technological future. The handmaid's medieval stroke Victorian style red habit and winged headdress always look ravishing in film and opera versions of the novel, and Atwood herself describes this figure as a sister dipped in blood, I presume a nun dipped in blood, which is a wonderful image to evoke that. But this sort of visual spectacle, where it arises in dystopian fiction, should not be seen as contrary to an authentic political narrative. Real-life totalitarian states have thrived on just this sort of seductive pageantry. We had a hint of that in the opening discussion about Stalin there. As Tambling writes, who defines what is anachronistic is crucial. Nazi Germany's use of advanced technology produced that strange hybrid, reactionary modernism. These are illustrations to a recent Folio Society edition of the novel by Elena and Anna Balbuso, and you'll also be familiar, I think, maybe with the recent television version that was screened on Channel 4. So, quoting from history in and through modernity is not just an attribute of totalitarianism, it also occurs in the aesthetic language of the 20th century avant-garde. So in Pablo Picasso's suite of paintings based on Las Meninas, Robert Rauschenberg's transfer drawings illustrating Dante's Inferno, the act of historical appropriation or anachronism takes centre stage. And both these figures recognised an ethical purpose in appropriating from history to satirise or comment upon the present. So you might be familiar with Pablo Picasso's reworking of Diego Velázquez, originally a depiction of court life at the time of Philip IV of Spain. And this is Picasso's unmistakable take on it. So it's not obviously, as you can see, a copy of the original. It's filtered through the language and the style that we associate with Picasso, which is a combination of his Cubist, his Surrealist, and his Iberian-influenced phase, the influence of Iberian masks and so forth, which everyone at this stage could recognise as his signature style. So in a way, it's a kind of really deliberate and exaggerated form of anachronism that it's present in the form. We're not allowed to forget that we're looking at this episode through the lens of contemporary modernity. And similarly, this, you might not be familiar with these works by Robert Rauschenberg. These were a series of illustrations that he did in the late 1950s to Dante's epic poem, particularly to the cantos that are involved in concerned with the descent into hell. And these were done using an interesting method which involves using solvent transfer, so like lighter fluid basically on top of a found image, a magazine image, and then placing a piece of paper over it and scratching over the top with a ballpoint pen. And then he went over the top and added further kind of marks and details. So it's another interesting way of making a collage. And the art historian Ed Kirkmer has recently written a whole book just about these images, and he's laboriously gone through and tried to identify where all the different kind of magazine images came from, and use this as a way to kind of analyse how Rauschenberg incorporated kind of analysis, an observation of his time in 1950s America into this fantastic depiction of hell. So Picasso saw the old regime of the 17th century Spanish court, depicted by Velázquez, as comparable to 1950s Spain, where Franco's dictatorship and the privilege of the monarchy endured. So in some ways the painting is seen as a follow-up to his Guernica, which was his famous anti-war painting. It's commenting about what he finds appalling still about the ongoing situation in his birth country. And Rauschenberg visualized Dante's hell through images collaged from news media and photographs of modern American life in the age of the Cold War and McCarthyism. And I'm drawing attention to their work partly because my own story that I read out to you began with painting, not initially with literature in mind. And in the story and in the images that go with the story, the idea of some kind of royal court, a space that's like a royal court, merges with the idea of a transcendental mythological space equivalent to Dante's hell as imagined by Rauschenberg. And we could see this world as equivalent to the idea of a painting as we might view it in contemporary culture, as an object of austere hierarchy and magical separateness, of old world charm and glamorous obsolescence. So anybody who has studied painting over the last 30 or 40 years in art school or has practiced it in an environment where these ideas are being discussed, they're aware of the idea that painting is an obsolete medium. It's no longer relevant to a contemporary world. And for some commentators, this is becoming increasingly the case because our imaginative and our cultural lives and even our social lives are so dominated by this virtual world, this world we experience as immaterial once we log onto the computer and start engaging with our phones or tablets or whatever. And in a way, I'm kind of quite interested in just embracing the idea of this obsolescence. I think it's a kind of exciting idea from a creative point of view. And though the story that I read out isn't what we call a work of ekphrasis, it doesn't describe the paintings. It did evolve partly as a result of thinking about the particular challenges involved in making these works and in making a painting, sort of motivating yourself to make a painting in a contemporary context. And we could argue that similar challenges are facing other types of cultural activity, for example, literary fiction, and there's been some debate about this going back now a number of years. In the year 2000, Umberto Eco, who you'll be familiar with as the author of The Name of the Rose, acknowledged the rising trend of interactive storytelling online, which was coming into sort of being at that time. And he observed that not only could writers now create infinitely open-ended narratives that other people could log onto and then add a bit on and it would kind of go on forever, they could also take existing narratives from our culture and tamper with them and change the denouement of classic plots and perhaps intermerge the stories of, for example, Madame Bovary and Pinocchio. So Eco compared this process to making a collage, for example, putting together fragments of The Marriage of the Virgin, of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and the latest Pokemon story. But whilst acknowledging the fun creativity it might allow, he warned against disintegrating our stable narratives. He felt that it was very important, especially, he stated, with fictional narratives, that we respect the parameters that have been established by their authors. And he said that unchangeable stories, he wrote, make tangible the impossibility of changing our destiny. Stories that are already made also teach us how to die. And so there's an existential component to this observation. And so if we're thinking about the world of visual culture and painting, we could say that the equivalent of a unchangeable story, what Eco called an unchangeable story, is a painting with a resolved and satisfying composition. And I'm going to quote here from the T.J. Clark, who is a Marxist art historian particularly concerned with the history of painting and the history of modernist painting. And in his study of Picasso's Guernica, he writes that being, for human beings, seems to have as its very precondition being in, reaching out really or imaginatively and feeling the limits of a place. And so we could say that this model of aesthetic practice, characterized by a sense of an object's limits and its carefully worked out internal structure, is difficult to sustain in contemporary life. Perhaps limits have no authority now in a world where objects telling stories are apt to be dissolved into vast networks of signs and images, subject to endless modification in magnitudes that cannot be planned or anticipated. And I'm quoting there from another art historian, David Joselit, in a book, appropriately enough here, called After Art, and it's where he writes proposals of what he thinks will happen to artists and artworks in the age dominated by the internet, and it's not a very joyful proposition, I'd say. Okay. I'm just going to read out now one final short little paper. I promised in the title of the exhibition that I would make some particular reference to post-war culture, which I have touched on a little bit through some of the examples. And I'm going to read to you just a bit of an extract from another paper that I delivered at the American Society for Popular Culture's conference a couple of years ago. And it was looking at the work of an American illustrator and painter who was greatest notoriety was in the 1950s, called Ivan Earle, and who worked for Disney at that time. And it looks particularly at the work that he did for Sleeping Beauty, which is a Disney animated film released in the late 1950s, now absorbed as part of the Disney franchise, but has an unexpectedly interesting aesthetic lineage behind it. And it was also the very first film I ever saw at the cinema in the days when they used to recycle Disney films for theatrical release. And I've become very interested in the fact that much of my childhood in the 1980s was in some way conditioned by the culture of the 1950s and the 1960s, including in very potent form in illustrational language for some reason. And I have a very strong nostalgic but also slightly anxious relationship to this material. So I wanted to understand it further by drawing on some of my expertise and researching further into the aesthetic context for this type of imagery. The philosopher of anachronism, Jeremy Tambling, has argued that what is postponed appears as anachronistic. Drawing a metaphor from the world of modern travel, he writes that jet lag, décalage horaire, or time gap in French, places one time, that of the body, inside another time. Literally, it postpones it. The Beauty, in Charles Perrault's famous story for children, published in 1697, the first of its kind to be called La Belle au Bois de Main, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, is herself an anachronism, a body postponed, a figure from the ancient past recalled to life. And the prince who helps her to rise is struck with embarrassment, for though she is fully dressed and quite magnificently, she is dressed just like his great-grandmother in the fashion of a century before, and wears a point band peeping over her collar, and that's a direct quote from the Perrault text. And I'm not quite sure what a point band is. I meant to kind of look it up before I came to do this, but I think it's a particular type of collar arrangement that would have been a number of decades out of date when Perrault was writing this story in the late 17th century. And this is Gustave Doré's illustration for a 19th century edition, French edition of the story. And this is how Sleeping Beauty was meant to look when she's discovered, surrounded by cobwebs and creepers, not unlike the vision that Charles Dickens conjures of Miss Havisham when she's discovered in Satis House, having been there all that time. Yes, there's a very clear indication that a lot of time has passed by. So the great disappointment of the Disney film is the absence from the story of this time-convulsive aspect. The lovers are acquainted in this version prior to the evil curse that puts Aurora, the Sleeping Beauty, to sleep. And the hero rides to the rescue much more promptly than his textual counterpart, of whom the beauty was justified in complaining. "Is it you, my prince? You have waited a great while." So though the idea of time lost and the idea of time regained are absent from the film's story, the feeling of time displaced is present by visual inference. And the look of the film was largely the responsibility of Ivan Earle, a painter and illustrator and sometime greetings card designer, who single-handedly authored many of the elaborate production backgrounds used in the finished film. And that's Ivan Earle working on the backgrounds for the film in the Disney studio. So by the 1950s, modernism as a style had been widely accepted and commodified. The mid-century vogue, driven by the post-war consumer boom and by advances in materials and fabrication technology, by the increased influence of design reformists, and by a collective desire in the aftermath of the Second World War to reject the past in favour of a utopian futurism. And it was heterogeneous in its look and philosophy. So it might incorporate such wide-ranging aspects as a return to hand craftsmanship, a geometric machine style, or an organic biomorphous silhouette. But linking these diverse permutations of the new was a prevailing aspiration to liberate design aesthetics from the stagnating influence of the previous century, of the 19th century. As the editors of Interiors magazine proclaimed in 1948, "We do not approve of a Georgian dining room, no matter how beautifully reproduced, on the 32nd floor of a skyscraper hotel." And I think we did get Queen Anne furniture in skyscrapers, but that was nonetheless the aspiration was to these clean lines and the kind of vogue of modernism. And it was very influential in the field of the applied arts and illustration, drawing influence from modernist painters like Henri Matisse and the way that they had flattened the picture space and made a kind of decorative form out of the picture space. And this was felt in all areas of illustration, of arts, book illustration, but also in cartoons and animation of this period. A rival studio to the Disney studio emerged in the post-war age called UPA, and this is a cartoon called Rooty Toot Toot, which exemplifies this very non-realist, quite flat-orientated, linear, bold colouring kind of approach that was becoming very in vogue at this time. And the Disney studio was always trying to keep up with anything that was becoming fashionable. And so they started to produce their own cartoons in this style, including this animated short cartoon, Toot, Whistle, Plunk and Boom, which was designed by Ivan Earle, the artist that I've already mentioned. And you may be able to tell that this is a style that's not the typical Disney commercial style that had been established in the 30s and 40s, which had becoming, very much dominated by nostalgia and by aesthetic forms that Disney himself was enamored with, inspired by kind of 19th century illustration art and so forth. So the need to keep pace with contemporary fashion jarred with Disney's thrall to nostalgia, the retro fetish of the Disney brand. And for Sleeping Beauty, Earl conducted research into 14th and 15th century European tapestries, paintings, and illuminated manuscripts, drawing on a wide range of early Renaissance and primitive Gothic sources. Dürer, Bruegel, Van Eyck, Botticelli, the Tres Richeurs of Jean-Duc de Barry, the famous Book of Hours, the unicorn and multiflower tapestries, as well as Persian miniatures and Japanese prints. So why medieval? Why does that become the style for representing the story? Perrault's original story, the literary story, is full of references to the Baroque French culture of his day, and many illustrators since have favoured a late Mannerist or Rococo setting. So this is an illustration by Edmond Dulac to an edition from 1910, which shows this kind of more 18th century kind of approach going on. So the story had come under pre-Raphaelite influence, for example in Edward Burne-Jones' celebrated murals made for Buscott Park in Oxfordshire between 1870 and 1890. And so we could say that Earl's concept, working in the 1950s, is doubly anachronistic. It borrows heavily from an earlier retrospective tradition, so the tradition in the 19th century that was in turn looking back to the medieval period. But his version of the Gothic style went far beyond the 19th century medievalist paradigm with its truth-to-nature ideals. John Hench, another artist who worked on the film, thought the pre-Renaissance works, with their lack of spatial depth and modelling, would translate well into animated cartoons. As Hench put it, the images in 15th century tapestries have crisp edges, and the planes are scarcely defined, except by a kind of superimposition for distance, rather than linear perspective. So there's an implication then that Eyvind arrives at the modern pictorial form partly by imitating the medieval style. And indeed, the compositional preference for verticals, horizontals, and angles, as opposed to curvature, is reminiscent both of the primitive technique of Gothic artists, but also the so-called machine aesthetic of mid-century modern architecture and product design. In the woodland settings for the film, grass verges and foliage appear to be squeezed into implausibly sharp, prismatic or rectilinear masses. And this effect reverses the histrionic conceits of Art Nouveau, where flowing contours of moving liquids or plant forms are deployed to mitigate and fetishize industrial materials. In Earl's designs for Sleeping Beauty, the hard-edged qualities of industrially manufactured objects are displaced onto nature itself. So you'll be familiar with the Art Nouveau and all the undulation going on. Here we have, even in the forest, even in nature, something much more angular, hard-edged, pointy. So these are like pre-production sketches, conceptual paintings made before, in the process of designing the film. And this is an actual completed background, a film still from the film itself, and you can see these odd angles going on there, hidden in the background, slightly buried perhaps beneath this fussy Victorian style. And it's part and parcel of the aesthetic of its time, the cutting edge aesthetic of its time, including aesthetic forms like the Eames House, which integrated in nature. They did so in order to break it up into these exciting planes and angles. So, to refer to the idea of anachronism then, this is an instance of temporal disorder that reverses the usual understanding of the term. Earl's simulation of history is not flawed by some irregular detail, like the clock in Julius Caesar, which is a famous example of anachronism in literature. But fated to impurity because the originary image of the past so closely resembles the design of the present. The medieval tapestries already look like mid-century modern cartoons, as the Disney artists were quick to recognise. The literary critic Joseph Lutzy has recently proposed that certain examples of anachronism in fiction can collapse the boundaries between the work's internal means of reference and its external historical context. So they force it to have a dialogue with its own time period, even when it's trying to escape, sometimes in romanticized terms, to a time in the past. So applying a similar idea to the medium of animated film, we could ask, what is the meaning of this collapse when modernism has been accepted as the aesthetic and cultural norm? And the mid-century modern, the age of the 50s and 60s, was a genre structured by anachronism, we could say, by time lagging behind, because it brought to late flower the ideas and practices of an earlier, more radical aesthetic phase. Post-war design culture was heavily informed by the European experiments of the previous decades, by the Bauhaus and international style and architecture, by Matisse's elaboration of the picture plane, by surrealist painting and sculpture. So in other words, this new aesthetic relied on forms and ideas that had been a long time waiting to come to popular fruition, at least, a decade or a couple of decades. The other understanding now that we have of post-war culture is that it's a time that is maybe not unlike our own, fraught with anxiety. And the architecture historian Robin Schuldenfrei has argued that this may have been occasioned by the accelerated, if partial, liberalisation of social mores, or the shadow of the Cold War and the ever-present nuclear threat. And we could argue that neither Ivandale or the Disney company are immune to these anxieties, even at a subconscious level. Indeed, it's during her final transformation into a dragon that the evil fairy Maleficent unleashes one of the film's most potent and sinister anachronisms. In Earl's sketch of this episode, and in its final version on screen, the conflagrations that briefly surround her resemble an atomic cloud.
We'd like to thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I think it was an extremely rich talk, and I don't know about your perspective on this, but having seen image after image on this screen from kind of the whole spectrum of your sort of resources against one of your own artworks, it really sort of showed to me this kind of anachronistic kind of tendency, your own practice, this kind of layering of different references as well as kind of imagery. There's so much to unpack here. I just sort of wonder, if we want to kind of explore maybe, the notion of kitsch and what that means now in the 21st century, and because I think a lot of this sort of folds onto the kind of political moment.
Yes.
In the present, and
yeah.
I'm sort of wondering about my own nostalgia and what that means.
Yeah.
And I'm also troubled by it and fascinated by it. But I have the same 80s perspective as you do on those kind of children's picture book illustrations.
Yeah.
And I sort of go back to that moment a lot and that visual culture, but it's always seemed suspect. And
yes.
That kind of fascination and kind of interest in almost an excessive narrative content is often seen as fey, or kind of people dismiss it, I think, often. But I think you really demonstrated there the kind of the richness of actually kind of delving into that and kind of bringing it to the fore. I just sort of wonder. I mean, what your show's done to me is really made me question this moment aesthetically and what we can do as makers and curators around that. If that makes sense.
Well, that's a nice and interesting response.